Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our monthly Hazardous Webinar series, where we take a closer look at one of Natural Hazard Research Australia's research projects, its findings and how it will be translated into practice with members of the project team and the people who are going to use the research. My name's Nicola Moore and I'm one of the Node Research Managers with the Centre. I'm based in our Brisbane office. But before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge that we're all gathered from across a range of different Aboriginal lands today. I am a guest here on Yuggera Turrbal lands in Meanjin, Brisbane, as I am wherever I walk in Australia because sovereignty has never been ceded. And I pay my respects to the Yuggera Turrbal elders, past, present and emerging, and also to any First Nations people joining us online today. These lands and waters across our country have always been places of teaching, research and learning. And First Nations people have long looked after and cared for country as kin and continue to do so today. All of us can play a fundamental role in dismantling the ongoing processes of colonisation by supporting Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people on this journey. After all, we all share the same fundamental goal, and that is resilient and sustainable landscapes and communities and everything in between. So thank you all for joining us today. Today's webinar will be recorded and a link to it and any presentation materials will be made available in the coming weeks to you. Please let us know if you have any technical problems by adding the details to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and our team will help troubleshoot any issues with you. The questions today will be answered at the end of the formal panel presentations. Please add them to the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen, making sure you specify who your question is for, and we'll get to them after the presentations. We'll also be sharing a survey link with you towards the end of the session. We really want to seek your input into the ways this research could be applied and used within your respective contexts. So I encourage you all to participate when we make that available. It's my pleasure today to introduce the 5 panellists. First of all, Dr. Carla Mooney is the Manager of Social Science and Service Policy in the Decision Support Services of the Bureau of Meteorology. Carla has a breadth of experience in applied social science across the public sector, research and consultancy, and has been with the Bureau for 12 years. And Carla is the lead researcher for this project. Victoria Heinrich is a policy advisor in the Social Science and Service Policy team at the Bureau as well, and is a psychology PhD candidate at the University of Tasmania. And Vicky has worked as a weather observer with the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia and Antarctica for over 15 years. Dr. David Wilke is a senior policy and research advisor at the Bureau. David is a meteorologist with a background in research and operations and has worked across a range of severe weather forecasting roles. And Karen Hudson is a hydrologist with extensive experience in developing and delivering operational flood forecasting services, both in the UK and here in Australia. Her work background spans several roles, including operational, policy, project, service improvement and stakeholder engagement. And Steve Muncaster, who's the Principal Advisor, Emergency Management Reform with the Victorian SES. Steve has been employed for many years in the private and public sectors, covering technical and policy aspects of emergency management. He's got extensive experience advising emergency services during significant flood response operations and is the inaugural chair of the AFAC Flood and Severe Weather Intelligence Technical Group. We've been really fortunate to have Steve on the management committee for this project. His knowledge and experience has provided valuable guidance for the project, and we're grateful to have him with us today to share his perspectives on the project as an end user of the research. So in our February Hazardous Webinar, we're going to learn what the research says on how systems, people and public messaging can be prepared and coordinated to reduce the impact of flash floods and enhance community resilience. The need for this research was identified at the beginning of NHRA's life by a consultation with representatives from across the emergency management sector, all jurisdictions and all levels of government. And together we further scoped this project along with another 2 Bureau-based projects via a series of stakeholder workshops early in 2022. Flash flooding and the effective communication of uncertainty was a key priority identified by stakeholders as needing further research to improve practice. And this early work on the stakeholder priorities resulted in the development of 3 linked projects with the Bureau. The flash floodings case study project that we're about to present to you today, as well as the long-range flood outlook for strategic preparedness, and another project looking at developing an integrated predictive capability for extreme rainfall and inundation. And I might ask our communications folk to share the links to these 3 projects with you if you want any further information regarding the projects. But the responsibility for flash flood warnings and systems actually lie with the states and territories in partnership with local governments where appropriate. And the Bureau's role is to provide forecasts and warnings for severe weather conditions and potential heavy rainfall that could lead to flash flooding. And this includes issuing severe weather warnings, severe thunderstorm warnings, and tropical cyclone warnings. These arrangements highlight the shared responsibilities across Commonwealth, state, territory, and local governments in emergency management. And the complex landscape of flash flood warnings involves multiple agencies. And this project emphasises the importance of a multidisciplinary collaboration to improve weather forecasting and communication of uncertainties to emergency managers and communities. A value chain approach was used to investigate the flows of information from meteorologists and modellers through emergency management agencies to communities, highlighting where and how the provision of probabilistic forecast and warning information might improve understanding of and response to forecasts of flash flooding. Carla and her team used a case study approach for this project, drawing upon past events and the lived experience of emergency management personnel involved at key stages across the warnings value chain. Many stakeholders have been involved in this case study work, and on behalf of NHRA, I'd like to acknowledge their time and valuable contributions to the project. This case study approach provided Carla and her team with rich data to generate insights and findings that hold value and relevance for agencies involved and beyond, in terms of identifying areas for improvement, enhancing interagency communication, agency readiness, and public communications and warnings. So I'd like to hand over now to Dr. Carla Mooney and her research team to start the presentation. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you for the lovely introduction, Nicola. So I am going to be talking, so the 4 of us are going to be providing the presentation today. So I'm just going to give a bit of an introduction, actually recap a little bit of what Nicola has talked about, and then David, Karen and Vicky will give different parts of the presentation, and I'm going to come back at the end to wrap it up, hopefully. So Nicola mentioned that there's 3 related projects that were identified in that stakeholder workshop a couple of years ago. So there are 3 related projects that the Bureau is delivering that are really looking to improve the prediction, lead time and communication of flood risk. And this is project 1 that we're talking about. And this project, the findings of this project are going to flow into the subsequent projects, and some of the outcomes are being utilised specifically in project 2. So in this project, we've really tried to look closely at what works well in the current service and what doesn't, to identify potential gaps and improvements. For the purpose, I mean, Nicola's talked a little bit about roles and responsibilities for flash flooding. And for the purposes of this project, we're using the definition that's in the Intergovernmental Agreement about the provision of Bureau services to states and territories. So in a way, it's an administrative definition, and that's really just established to confirm what roles and responsibilities were. But essentially what we're talking about is flooding of short duration with relatively short lead times. And in the case of what we're talking about, it's a lead time of less than 6 hours. As Nicola mentioned, the prime responsibility for flash flood warning lies with states and territories and through their local councils. And the Bureau provides forecasts and warnings for heavy rainfall that may lead to flash flooding. And we also provide a range of decision support services to support the activities of states and territories in providing their service. So we've taken a really kind of broad approach with this. And so we sort of at the beginning of the project identified the study questions that we had, which really were to dig into the idea, is flash flooding well understood by the community and emergency services? And is uncertainty around the forecast communicated effectively? And to look at this question, we've done a quantitative survey to establish sort of a baseline about understanding. But some of those issues have been explored as well through the case study analysis, and David will be talking a little bit to that. So what we really wanted to understand is how the quality or the fidelity of information is changed as it passes from the Bureau to the agencies to the public. And do we get the balance between lead time and uncertainty right? And most importantly, of course, is the question about how does all this affect the community response? The really fundamental question of value is, are people getting what they need to be able to act and respond to mitigate the harm of this hazard? We've mentioned this idea of a value chain, which is kind of, I think, a language that might seem a bit odd, but the reality is in flooding and in flash flooding, there's a very robust understanding about a service value chain. And when you look on the right of this slide, I think this was originally in Flood Manual 13 or whatever it was, which really identified roles and responsibility across the warning service value chain. And it looked at the different actors so we could all understand who was doing what when, because of the nature of the shared responsibility and the importance of collaboration in delivering a service to the community. So what we've done in this case are descriptive case studies of the end-to-end warning value chain, and to help understand really where the system is working well and where it's not, and how it meets the needs of users. So we've used a mixed method approach. You'll see as this webinar goes on, we've got a very multidisciplinary team, and the foundation of all the activities is collaboration. So it began with the initiation of our partners and stakeholders, and the case studies have been developed and delivered with very close collaboration with those people involved in providing the service. Karen is going to be talking a little bit about the case studies and the sites we've talked about. And David, who's going to be speaking after Karen, is going to be speaking a lot more about the appraisal we made of how the services worked. The methodology we've used and the approach we've used has been really founded on a large project that was run by the World Meteorological Organization, and it's called the Value Chain Project. And the image you're looking at there is actually what we might call an end-to-end warning chain as compared to the service value chain that I showed on the earlier slide. So this really looks at all the technical aspects as well as the outcome aspects of the value chain. What's important to note in this, and what's important from the perspective of communication of uncertainty, is the links between different aspects. So how, for example, weather forecast information is communicated and transferred to inform a hazard forecast and so on. It's a sort of idealized version because we know it doesn't work in this sort of natural sequential way and that there's iterations, but essentially it's just a way of describing how the system works together. If you would like any further information or guidance about this project, there's a lot of resources that have been developed as part of that project, and the link on that screen would take you to a site where you can get a framework document, a questionnaire and a guide, and these are a lot of the resources we've used in the project. I mentioned that the second part of the project was looking at specifically the communication challenge, and why we think that's so important is because there's a lot of uncertainty in forecasting for flash flood. So there's uncertainty in the rainfall forecast, there's uncertainty in aspects about flash flooding that are not readily quantifiable. So what we've undertaken is a survey of public and emergency management about their understanding of flash flood and certainty around its occurrence. And the basis for that is some pretty good evidence that the public don't have a good understanding of the factors that contribute to flash flooding, and that there's a lot of research around that shows that words like possible, probable, and chance have different meanings to the public, meteorologists and emergency management. So that's what we're kind of testing through this project. I'm now going to hand to Karen.
Thank you, Carla, and good morning, everyone. So what I'm going to be doing now is providing a little bit of background and context to the case studies. And then I'll hand over to David, who will provide a bit more detail about the performance of each element of the value chain. So as mentioned earlier, the nomination of case studies was actually really collaborative approach. So our key stakeholders in the project actually nominated some case studies which were really important to them and warranted a bit more investigation for one reason or another. We also tried to choose case studies to highlight a range of flash flood type events that occur in Australia. So what we actually did, so once we'd chosen those case studies, we did a full sort of desktop review and analysis of those. So that was amongst stakeholders at the Bureau itself, looking at the warnings and the weather forecast, but also key collaboration with all of our stakeholders to look at what warnings went out there, what were the impacts on the ground, who said what when. We did some interviews with key players, so one-on-one, just gathering a bit more information. And then we actually went in to do some workshops to discuss and refine the information that we'd found. And then as part of the final reporting, we're doing a cross-case study comparison of all of that information. So the case studies that we actually ended up choosing are these three that you can see on the screen. So the first case study for Wallace Creek, this was actually quite unusual in that it ended up resulting in isolations of people for multiple days. So it was a flash flood event that was part of an East Coast low affecting that part of New South Wales. But it was also, I guess, flash flood for that catchment, Wallace Creek, but also combined with a wider riverine flood event as well. As I mentioned, yeah, so widespread isolation in this event for many days, but also there was some concerns about the integrity of the levee. Case study 2, Hobart. So this was much more of a short duration event caused by severe thunderstorms, exceptionally intense rainfall in that event. So something like 100 to 230 millimeters in around 6 to 12 hours. Sort of much rarer than a 1% AEP during the very heaviest rainfall. It caused widespread damage to the urban area of Hobart CBD, around 135 million damages attributed to that event. And it was unusual in that, I guess in all of these three events, David will come on to this, that there were problems with the forecast rainfall in the lead up. So significant uncertainty throughout all three events, but particularly in this Hobart case, initially it was damaging winds that was looked to be more likely. And the flash flooding was a lower probability until quite soon before the event. And one other thing to highlight about this event is that the previous event of a similar magnitude had actually happened in 1960. So there was quite a lot of, I guess, diminished community memory about the impacts of these types of events. And then thirdly, Adelaide. So this is another event that was caused by severe thunderstorms. It's the most recent of the events we looked at. And the thing to highlight about the Adelaide case is that Adelaide is quite often impacted by heavy rain, has a lot of flash flood type events occurring. So it's sort of more commonplace. It was a lower impact of the three that we looked at, but it does occur very frequently In this case, it was quite significant because the warnings that went out were actually, they first started to come out overnight, the severe thunderstorm warnings, and it was an urban sort of flash flooding, rush hour type event. So quite significant traffic disruption for the community. Just moving on. So those are the 3 case studies. In terms of the approach that I mentioned, so once we'd looked at all the information of what had happened, we held these in-person workshops, as I've mentioned. We had attendance from a range of agencies, so from the Bureau, from the SES, from local government, state government, also local stormwater projects and teams. So it was a really collaborative way to sort of work through the information. So we had a mix of sort of presentations, replaying the event and what had happened. We then did a bit of group activity and discussions, looking at each element of the value chain, as Carla touched on earlier, trying to sort of share knowledge about what happened and where we thought that, things, where were the issues that had happened and where are the sort of opportunities to improve. And then at the end of the workshops, we actually went through a bit of a scoring exercise. So we asked participants to score each element of the value chain on a sort of qualitative scale of 1 being poor to 5 being excellent. And we touched on each of those elements. So, from the observations through the weather forecasts to the sort of hazard and impact forecasts, and then looking at the warnings themselves and how they were communicated, and ultimately how the community responded to those, with a final sort of overall scoring about the value chain. So we asked people to do that individually, and then we took a sort of collective average score for each element and for each workshop. So what I'm going to do now is actually hand over to David, who will take you through each of those elements and how they performed, and he'll give some examples as we go along. So thank you, David. Over to you.
Thanks, Karen. So rather than look at each individual case study in detail, what we're going to do instead is consider a sort of generalized summary for each of the components of the value chain. And this way, it means that we can look at the sort of typical function and performance of each component and see how and where uncertainty plays a role. So starting first with observations. So this is sort of right at the upstream end of the value chain. Key observations that we're talking about in flash flood events are typically rain gauge observations, water level observations, but also importantly, radar and satellite observations. And observations, generally the initial role in the value chain is as input into weather models to drive forecasts of heavy rainfall, but OBS also have a critical role sort of later on for situational awareness. As Carla was saying, it's not a linear progression. We have interactions across the chain. So OBS can be used at kind of multiple points in the chain, and they're important in warning and response decisions. What we found from the case studies is that OBS coverage is fairly patchy across Australia. That obviously introduces some uncertainty. We don't exactly know what the conditions of the landscape or the rainfall is at a point, but coverage is generally better in the high population areas. And because the case studies we looked at were generally around those high population areas, particularly Hobart and Adelaide, it was the highest ranked component across our case studies in the value chain. So there are a few notable gaps, as I mentioned. Coverage lacks in some places. For example, in the Wallace Creek case study, there was no rated flood gauge, so difficult to know exactly what's going on in that area during the flood event. But in general, observations performed well. So if we look now at the next component of the value chain, which is the weather forecast. In flash flood events, what we're talking about here are the numerical weather prediction forecasts of rainfall. So these are often the kind of first significant intelligence you get to inform warning and response strategies. It's often the first indication that flash flooding is a risk. We can use models. We do use weather models to try to quantify uncertainty in rainfall, especially ensemble rainfall forecasts, which can give a spread of potential outcomes. But what we've found, and I think this sort of confirms perhaps some hypotheses before the project started, current models rarely predict extreme rainfall accurately. So this is true in each of the case studies, as Karen mentioned. In all events, there was some indication that heavy rainfall could occur, but it was not possible to say with confidence where it would occur or exactly how much would fall. And so for this reason, the component was scored average for all of the case studies. it was deemed to be valuable intelligence as a sort of heads up to give that indication that there was a risk. But in no instances did it accurately pick the events, and it did leave significant uncertainty for warnings and response. So the third and fourth components of the chain of the hazard forecast and impact forecast. And so what this part of the chain is really about taking that information about heavy rainfall and determining what's going to happen. These two were consistently found to be the weakest points in the chain. This is because for the case studies we looked at, there's really no capability in this place. It's in this space. There's really reliance on local knowledge of past events to determine what the impact might be if we see certain rainfall or we see certain flood levels, but not any particularly quantifiable or sort of well-defined way to translate heavy rainfall into impact. It's important to say at this point that outside of the case studies we looked at, there are a handful of locations that have flash flood warning services where there is a bit more of an integrated approach at hazard forecasting, so flash flood forecasting, for example, in Parramatta. But in the case study events that we considered, these two components were the lowest ranked because the capability is the least mature. So the next component of the value chain is the warnings and how the warnings were communicated. When we talk about warnings, what we're generally talking about in flash flood is information from the Bureau, like the severe weather warnings, or severe thunderstorm warnings, or information from emergency services like evacuation warnings and evacuation orders. All cases that we looked at predated the introduction of the Australian warning system, but it was noted that in each case that AWS had brought some substantial improvements in the flash flood value chain. So further case studies at a later date may be necessary to help kind of explore this updated warning landscape. But generally what we found in our case studies is that warnings in flash flood are reactive. They often don't provide much lead time for appropriate response, which then leads to issues and uncertainty further down the chain. But despite this, in our case studies, the warnings were generally seen as performing well. We had warnings that were issued prior to each of the events. There was a lot of communication that was done around the events to push the message out. So a lot of press conferences, various media to support the warnings. But there were some notable issues, particularly with the language that's used in our warnings, which we'll touch on shortly. Now, the final component of the value chain is the response. And this is really about actions to protect life and property. So at one end, you've got things like sandbagging, road closures, but at the other end, you've got evacuations and flood rescues. As with warning, communication response was found to be reactive in our case studies, but exactly how it performed varied across the studies. So in the Wallace Creek case study, that's sort of generally longer lasting case study, longer lasting flood event due to the East Coast low, it performed highly successfully. So it was actually ranked equal first in the chain, but it was relatively lowly ranked in the others. And that's likely because in the Wallace Creek event, there was a longer perceived lead time. So even though there was quite a lot of uncertainty in the event, there was a lot of time for people to prepare and take actions. Whereas the other two events in Hobart and Adelaide was shorter lead time, and there was less time for people to react. In the Wallace Creek event, there was also quite a significant community response. We had places that were isolated for up to 9 days. So significant impact on the community there, and they were sort of really required to band together to get through that period. So this likely contributed to the higher rating for response in this case study. What do we take out of these case studies in terms of uncertainty? We've kind of looked at the full value chain. It's probably what we already knew to an extent. Uncertainty is endemic across the value chain and affects all the components individually to varying extents. And then we have flow-on effects from one component to the next. For example, we have uncertainty in the rainfall, how much will fall, then how the landscape will respond, how much flooding will occur, whether infrastructure like levees will hold up, and then whether the community will react. So we know uncertainty is endemic. The challenge is to effectively communicate it. How well do we do this? Well, probably not that well at this stage. So you can see on the screen there on the bottom left, we've got an excerpt from a warning that was issued during the Wallace Creek case study, just showing the sort of way that we typically communicate uncertainty in heavy rainfall events. And we've got multiple terms that we're using. So heavy rainfall, which may lead to flash flooding, is forecast to continue. Rainfall totals between 70 to 120 millimetres are possible. So the big question that we have is around understanding of these terminologies. Do the meteorologist that issues it, the EM personnel who receives it, the community member who reads it understand it, all have a shared understanding of what it means? And to dig into this sort of part of the question, Vicky's going to talk about the survey that was run.
Thanks, David. Hello, everyone. So as a part of our mixed methods approach, we included using a survey to help answer our questions around how well do people understand flash flooding and is uncertainty terminology well communicated. So the survey was open from February to March last year, and participants over 18 years old were recruited through word of mouth, the NHRA newsletter and the Bomb Ideas mailing list, which includes people who have volunteered to participate in Bureau research. The research questions examined included perceptions and knowledge of flash flood, protective actions, experience with flood, people's comprehension of warning messages and information preferences. We had 1,235 participants and more than half had flood experience, any kind of flood experience, and we had 31% of people who identified as being part of the emergency management sector. So it was a great response from the community and everyone. People had different understandings of flash flooding. Overall, we could say that flash flooding is not well understood. There is a general level of knowledge that's fairly low. People know some factors, but are not necessarily aware of the specifics or the definitions. And people did overestimate how much they know about flash flooding. For example, people knew that the correct in terms of flash flooding, it's caused by heavy rain, but they also often thought that storm surge might cause flash flooding, and factors like knowing flash flooding is associated with with creeks and heavy rainfall, so you stay away from low-lying areas, but then they also might wait for more information in terms of a behavioural response, which is less desirable. People also had varying levels of knowledge around the risk factors and environmental factors that might influence the occurrence of flash flood. People linked the amount of rainfall in the last 24 hours to flash flood, but were less likely to consider factors like how built up or urbanised an area is, and the amount of rainfall in the past month, so how dry or wet the system was, which are also important in the occurrence of flash flood. These factors were rated as less important. In terms of the uncertainty wording, we asked each participant saw 2 questions. You receive the following flash warning message for your location. Heavy rain, which may lead to flash flooding, is possible or likely. We used the alternate wording there. And what do you think the likelihood or percent chance of either heavy rain or flash flooding is? So as you can see, people understood these terms differently, and that the likely and possible had different values and ranges to different people, and also the context of whether we were talking about the flash flood event or the hazard of heavy rain influenced people's rating or the percent chance likelihood they thought of the event occurring. So the box plots on this figure show the spread of people's responses. So basically, likely and possible could mean anything from 0 to 100% chance of likelihood. And there was also overlap in the ranges of likely and possible for both the heavy rainfall event and the flash flood event. So the World Meteorological Organization has a forecast likelihood scale, and this is what they have as recommended ranges for words like likely to be from 70 to 80% probability, and possible, they say, is a lower range and it's from 30 to 44% probability. As you can see, our results do not match these recommended ranges. The spread is much broader, and then although the use of the term likely made people think it was more certain, although there was a higher probability range, it did not often match that 70 to 89%, and possible was most definitely much higher in the ranges people thought than what the WMO recommends. So we can say that these verbal or qualitative probabilities are fuzzy, they're less clear in their meaning, and people interpret them in different ways. And uncertainty, like this kind of incomplete information, can delay decision making, which puts people at greater risk, particularly when a fast response is needed, like for flash flood events. Research does show that people do make better decisions when uncertainty information is available compared to when it's not. Therefore, it might be a matter of better expressing uncertainty information in our warnings and forecasts by using predictive intervals or ranges, numbers and words, and educating people about their use. So I'll now hand back to Carla.
Thanks, Vicky. So I guess just bring it all together. When we think back to the work that Karen and David have talked about, the case studies have identified a range of areas for potential improvement. What was called out was rainfall forecasts, some gaps in observation, particular issues around the hazard forecasts, some issues around warning communication, and really some conversations that really came through in the workshops was about how well information flowed between different actors in the warning value chain. The related project, which we mentioned earlier, which is the integrated predictive capability for extreme rainfall and inundation that Paul Fox-Hughes from the Bureau is leading, is actually focused on this area of hazard forecast and impact forecasts. So in this case, we can identify a technical project that's going to assist with this information gap. But as I think we understand from Vicky's presentation, the survey has confirmed that current understanding of language is not well understood, of the language we use around either what is a flash flood or the way we talk about the uncertainty related to it. I think we've all mentioned that there's been significant improvements in practice across the 3 case studies since the work was done, since the events occurred actually. So there's been a lot of work around warning communication. In some cases, some of the administrative arrangements about how information is shared or underlying documentation, and some work in terms of local flood intelligence. So they're interesting examples of different activities to improve the overall outcome at different parts of the warning value chain. I think what we're really highlighting through all this is that there are a number of communication challenges when it comes to providing an adequate service to the Australian community. So there's many steps and many actors, and reflecting back on the service value chain we began with, identified different players across the value chain. So we can understand that as information passes from one to the other, its fidelity is changed. I think the other factor around flash flood, which has really been highlighted by the hydro meteorology perspective, is that uncertainty is absolutely unavoidable. So it is sort of inherent into the way that hazard evolves. Specifically for flash flood, local factors which vary in space and time are really critical. And as well as that, we don't know how people are going to respond to behaviour, how they will perceive or understand what's going on. I think that's what's been revealed are a number of specific issues, some inconsistencies around language, the use of qualitative language to convey risk, which Vicky has demonstrated is really not well understood. And some inconsistency in terms, and providing information without a context, which doesn't really help its comprehension. So the requirement, the output, the major output of this project is preliminary guidance on the communication of uncertainty. And we're sort of thinking about that in 2 ways. One is in terms of the decision support services we provide, and related to that is the communication, which is communication through our decision support service, communication in our own warnings or warnings generally, and then other activities to address the gaps. So I guess what we would take away is from a decision support context, and this really came through in the case studies, that the requirement for uncertainty information varies depending on who you are and who you are that's making a decision. And the tolerance for uncertainty depends on what you're trying to do. So actually, in that decision support context, understanding those requirements is really important. I think the other thing is the need to communicate the limits of knowledge. And that was one of the really nice things that came through the workshops, with all the stakeholders there was really exposing our modelling and all that sort of stuff to the partners. And so just getting some insight into the complexity, uncertainty in the atmosphere that influences rainfall forecasting. We need to share information about thresholds better and use consistent language. I'm going to talk a little bit more about communication on the last slide, but one of the things is some gaps, and I think one gap that is really being filled, which was in existence at the time, is these much more dynamic and flexible tools that provided by the Australian Warning System, which enables localised warning and very specific calls to action. So it means that lack of knowledge about the hazard and what to do can be responded to quite quickly. The other thing is, I think, a need to provide better public education to raise awareness about flash flood. I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but part of the output of the project is some quite clear guidance about communicating probabilistic information, which is what we would call the formal measure of uncertainty. And I think knowing your audience is a big thing, because what we know is that most people can understand basic probability information well, and we have good, strong evidence that it improves decision making. Using numbers and words is really going to be a benefit, and graphics increase comprehension of probability information. So an output of the project will be a lot more detail around this, which will be made available to people outside the project. So my last slide really is just to say, is to make some acknowledgements. We want to thank Natural Hazards Research Australia for the opportunity to do this work, and particularly to Nicola for her support across the project. We've had a great project management committee, and Steve's going to be speaking later, a project reference group, and they've been very helpful in providing guidance. I think Nicola mentioned at the beginning our gratefulness to case study partners, stakeholders and participants, of which there were many. I think we had at least 60 people in our workshops, which has really made for a lot of richness in the case studies. And across the Bureau, the contribution has been broader than the team you see before you. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carla. That's wonderful. Can we hand over to Steve now?
Thanks there, Nicola, and to Karen and Carla and David and Victoria. Oh, just sharing my screen now. So I'll speak from an emergency services perspective with this. Carla, it was a good point where Carla ended there in terms of where do you go next in terms of using some of this information. And then, as we've seen before, and as this next slide demonstrates here, that emergency services is a key part of this value chain there that we've spoken about, that really we lead 4 out of those 6 elements there. And uncertainties is shown by that triangle at the bottom there, from your observation, your weather forecasting, as you then contribute to builds on the uncertainty or adds to the uncertainties that then comes up in your hazard forecasting and your impact forecasting as well. But when we get to the end point there, when we get to warnings and response, we really do need to be able to interpret what the uncertainty is saying and really make some binary decisions. Are we going to issue a warning? What is the type of advice we're going to provide to communities that are at risk here? What are we going to ask them to do? What are their calls for actions? So we do need to sort of, as I said, reduce that uncertainty. Well, probably not reduce the uncertainty, but interpret that uncertainty and communicate that uncertainty. Any reduction that we can realise in the uncertainty through any scientific advancement when it comes to the weather forecasting and the hazard forecasting is going to be beneficial. But really where some of the best gains can be made, and I think that's where Carla and particularly Vicky's presentation went to, is in that communication and understanding, both from emergency services side of things, but also to then out to the broader community and other stakeholders as well. Better decisions, better community outcomes, and I guess really trying to realise the value of this warning chain, and each part is adding to that value in the best possible way that it can do. Just looking, I guess, at a couple of examples here in Victoria. I'll go to the public information and warning side aspect to start with. What you see up there now is our current business rule for how we issue here in Victoria our Australian warning systems, notifications when it comes to more heavy rainfall or severe thunderstorm, severe weather. And I'll look at the rainfall component there. As you can see, really the weather forecasting piece is picked up in this first column there in the orange, really around the heavy rainfall or the intense rainfall. So that's, is it going to exceed a 10% AEP or 2% AEP? And then we keep coming back to these terms, and I'll keep saying them throughout my presentation, possible or likely. That is a key decision-making point for us in terms of what types of warnings we put out for particular thunderstorms events. So really key understanding between ourselves, the Bureau and the general public, and the general community and other stakeholders is really key to make sure, again, we maximise the value that we can here. When we look at the next component of the system here, when you come to the hazard forecasting, really how we deal with this in Victoria is looking at the duration of an event. This is a bit very qualitative or subjective piece here. Really is sort of suggesting that longer durations affect larger catchments, lead to greater depths, longer durations of flooding. Quite a qualitative approach to it. When we then move on into the impact forecasting, really that's where we pick up some of these issues to do with exposures and vulnerabilities. Time of day, we heard before some of the case studies occurred at peak hours, or was going to have a more significant impact. If we had recent events here as well, we building on a community which is already, its vulnerability is high because it suffered previous more recent events, and there may be some still in the recovery phase for that. Again, quite a qualitative approach, I should say, to this. How can we do this better? How can we look at these things? How can we model this? How can we sort of dissect this a little bit further? But then combining all those together, we then issued our warnings. And this, I guess, where is highlight at each point in that value chain that Carla spoke about before, the uncertainty, the understanding, and the communication of that uncertainty is really pivotal for us here, particularly in VicSCS and how we use the information we receive from the Bureau and how we then apply that across into AWS warnings in our context. Just quickly, I'll just go to the second example here, looking at how we stand up for events, for our readiness arrangements here in Victoria. Again, what we've got up there is our different readiness levels there. This really speaks to the type of resources we deploy, the types of messages we put out, and the types of command and control arrangements put in place. So how well are we prepared for this event? How quickly can we respond? And again, if we step through those aspects of the value chain, the weather forecast there really picked up in terms, again, possible and likely. Keep coming back to those two words for us, are very key words in terms of some of our decision making here. Looking then in terms of hazard forecast, it tends to overlap when we come to the readiness here and the way that we've constructed here in Victoria. Our exposure, also our impact forecasting is really picked up there again in some of these aspects to do with exposure and vulnerability. And then when we step it out, that then provides us with our readiness level. So again, some of these aspects that we've spoken about before, and just to wrap up, we often hear about we need more gauges, or we need more modelling. I'd argue maybe we need better communication. And I think that's something that this particular project can highlight. And certainly that communication of uncertainty. We need to talk about terminology, and we spoke about we need to speak the same language. And this is really a collaboration between ourselves, emergency services agencies and the Bureau, common description, common use of probability. We need to have an understanding. So we need to be hearing the same language. And this, again, this collaboration between ourselves and the Bureau in this space. Regular ongoing skills development and training. We need to include all roles in our incident management response here. So we all understand when we're communicating, whether it's internally or externally, what we're saying when we put certain terms around these particular events. And again, in a flash flooding context, don't have a lot of time here, so we don't have a lot of time to ponder these things or consider these things. We need to understand before we go how we're going to communicate here. And the last bit there, in terms of the application, we need to do what we're saying. We need to make sure as emergency services agencies here that we're consistent. We have a discipline around how we do these things. And again, that comes back to this ongoing training and ongoing capability and skills maintenance that we need to put into place. And we need to have that community engagement aspect here. And this is going to take some time, obviously, and it's always going to be something that's going to be always a work in progress. But I'll leave it there, Nicola, and hand back to yourself.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the Bureau team. Really good, detailed presentation. Really appreciate your time delivering it today. We've actually got quite a collection of questions as well. I just wanted to say to everybody, we can go over time if you would like to hang on past the hour so that we can get to as many questions as possible. But I will start with the first question, which is actually come from John Bates. And John is asking, how or will the team look at the timing of the floodwater flow once it's detected? And did the floodwater arrive at landmarks known by communities earlier, as expected, or later than predicted? Because in John's view, this is an important factor in communications and trust building. I might pass that over to Carla and the team to ask if that popped up in any of the case study workshops that you ran, whether you looked at that aspect.
Good. David's going to
answer. I can answer it, yeah. So I guess first of all, definitely agree that timing is a very important factor. In terms of timing of a flood, I mean, we were looking at flash flood events, which don't, I mean, the case studies we looked at, we didn't have flash flood forecasts. So in terms of the timing of the actual flooding, that wasn't so much a consideration because, yeah, there wasn't a lot of information about the water level issued ahead of time. But obviously, when you're talking about the rainfall forecasts, that's a big part of it. In general, as I said, the rainfall forecasts in each of the events was there were lots of issues, lots of uncertainties, and the uncertainty was around the amount of rainfall, but also around the timing. So agreed, it's a big part. It needs to be part of the discussion moving forward when we try to tackle uncertainty and how we communicate it. But in these events, because we weren't looking at case studies where flash flood forecasts were issued, we weren't able to look at flood timing and you know, the passing of floodwaters past locations, as you mentioned.
Okay. Thank you for that, David. I've noticed we've got a few folk dropping off the webinar, so I just wanted to quickly give a plug for our survey. We know that you've all listened with great attention, and we'd really like to invite you to share your thoughts on how this research could be used by yourself, your agency, and others. And Lena's going to share a link with you now to that survey while we deal with some other questions. All right. There's a question here about the survey. So regarding the age of the respondents, it seems that they're mostly seniors and very few youth. Would any of the Bureau team like to talk about the demographic profile that popped up in the surveys and why? Vicky?
So we didn't collect a lot of information like age and gender in this survey just because of the time frame and privacy. So we don't actually have that kind of information for this study. But we do have a bit of an idea from the BOM ideas. They've worked a lot harder to get more diversity, but we don't know which people on that mailing list did respond or not. But there is definitely often people who have more time are the older populations to be able to respond, or more interest in the weather can influence who responds. And we would assume that people who responded, like the emergency management participants, as well as the general public, were interested in weather and floods. But we can't really look at how that might affect our data beyond saying that this type of research needs to be expanded and more diverse across the community, and particularly English is a second language. We have a lot of migrants in this country, so that could also be a big factor that we unfortunately don't know much about, and yeah, we need more research.
Thanks, Vicky. Look, we've also got a comment here that's been offered up by Rob Webb, who's the CEO for AFAC, and previously with the Bureau as well. And I just want to note it for the recording. So Rob notes that uncertainty varies, but the way the uncertainty changes can be useful. There are some catchments where we would know that on most occasions rainfall rates needed to produce catastrophic flash flooding may not be predicted, and the warning system must calibrate to appropriate action and this predictability. If the system needs to work even 5% of the time without a prediction, you may choose a siren as a warning. So thank you for offering that contribution to the session today, Rob. We've got a question here from David Rose. Has the new flash flood forecasting system in Adelaide, have we got the right people to answer this? Has the new flash flood forecasting system in Adelaide addressed the concerns revealed in the study? Are we able to provide a comment on that from the Bureau's perspective, or is that more of an emergency management agency and we don't have South Australia represented on our panel today?
I think I perhaps just touch on one comment there, Nicola. So when we were going through and doing the case study for Adelaide, that I think that new flash flood forecasting system was just about to sort of be launched, go live in the sort of weeks ahead, the weeks down track of that. Personally, from this case study, I don't actually have a response as to how that's helped, but I guess it's something we could try and gather that later to sort of see what the impact of that has been.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if there may be someone online, I'm guessing, from that system potentially, but personally I don't have an idea of how it's gone. Thanks,
Karen. And if there is anyone online that can add something, please put your comments into the Q&A section. That would be great. We've got a comment here from Michelle. Hi, Lena. Unfortunately, the survey link says I don't have permission to view or respond to your form. I wonder if Lena and Bayer might be able to sort that out in the background as we continue. Tiana, my apologies. Tiana Hawkins asks, many thanks for the presentation. Were the intense rainfalls picked up in any of the outlying models in these case studies? And were these outliers communicated to emergency managers? Is that a David question?
Yeah, it's possibly a David and Karen question, but I can start. So I mean, I think in each case study, what the models did well was to indicate that there was sort of potential for heavy rainfall that could lead to flash flooding, but exactly which area was very uncertain. So, for example, in the lead up to the Wallace Creek case study, it was an east coast low, and over the days leading up, there were multiple different possibilities that kind of emerged from the models. We had east coast low forming on the far north coast, far south coast, had cases where there was going to be no rainfall over Maitland, and the Wallace Creek catchment, and then cases where there was significant rainfall. Generally, what we found was that, and I think this is kind of reflected in like the experience of operational meteorologists, often that really high-end rainfall isn't reflected in the models, and so there's often an element of like personal judgment that needs to be made around those more significant events. But ensembles can give you an idea and of the spread of rainfall, and as you sort of become sort of climatized and used to using these models, you can sense when they're sort of pointing in that direction. There's a lot of briefing that's done between the Bureau and the emergency services, so a lot of these potential outcomes were communicated and the uncertainty was communicated, but models very rarely pick exactly the rainfall total that you're going to see in these kinds of events.
Thanks, David. Carla noted that communications was the key issue that came out of the project, really. Is there any other areas of the warning value chain that you think should be prioritised for improvement from the study, or is it communications?
Is that on me or
on you, David?
Yeah,
that's for you.
Well, I mean, I think probably, there's a lot that we can do with the information that we have currently that we can do better. So I mean, communicating is one aspect of it. So looking at the language and the graphics and these kinds of things. But we have a lot of data at the more upstream end. So looking at the forecast, looking at the ensembles, there is just a lot of data there. Being able to actually interrogate it properly on shift is quite difficult for forecasters. And the link between the weather forecasts and the sort of hazard forecast, so actually sort of putting it into that space where you're determining whether flash flood is likely, what the inundation could look like. I think that sort of space is somewhere we could really focus a bit of attention, and that's what the project that sort of the sister project to this one that Paul Fox Hughes is leading, Carla mentioned, that's looking at that space. So I think in that area, building a bit more of a capability that's sort of similar to the fire behaviour predictive capability that we have on that side of things, building that for flash flood, I think is something that we should be putting some energy into.
Thanks, David. Someone from South Australia has given us some information in the Q&A regarding the flash flood system. They're noting it's partially gone live using the water ride application, but they're still going through minor changes required within the system. The system has been applied within 3 catchments: Dry Creek, BHK Creek and Adelaide Airport, and it will hopefully be put to practice within the coming months. So I've just read that out for the recording. Thank you. And I've got one last question to Steve. Do you want to share your thoughts, Steve, on how all these warnings work together to affect better community response, and any reflections on the Australian warning system flash flooding warnings that are starting to be used now?
Thanks, Nicole. I think it's certainly early days, and as Karen noted in her presentation, I think that sort of these case studies predate the use of AWS. It's probably something as a future piece of work we could look at, how they work together, the various warnings, and go to community and go from there. I think we need to make sure that they're obviously complementary and they're obviously build on one another, building on this various strengths of the agencies that are involved in the value chain. So I guess here in Victoria, we have, I said, implemented AWS for severe thunderstorms and severe weather, and used those rules that we spoke about before. The way we do flash flood warnings in Victoria here at the moment is based on observed observations. So we actually wait until we see a number of requests for assistance in an area to indicate the occurrence of flash flooding. But we are working back with other agencies, particularly here in the Greater Melbourne area with Melbourne Water, to look at how we might be able to improve some of the forecasting aspects that David was speaking about when it comes to flash flooding as well.
Yeah, good on you. Thank you, Steve. And there's one question that Teresa Chapman has asked, and it's probably maybe for both Carla and Steve. When you say we need more public education, is there a clear sense of whose responsibility that is?
I might go first, Carla, and I guess Carla highlighted this in the many actors when it comes to the value chain here. I think as we move towards more localised systems, and flash flooding is very localised, it probably lends itself to a much more on-ground, and either through the State Emergency Service in various jurisdictions. I know here in Victoria we do have a range of different programs that we roll out in conjunction with local governments and with some of the water authorities as well when it comes to flash flooding. It is an area I think that more focus could be put on, but I think it's probably best done at that local level, given the very localised nature of the effects that you're talking about here.
Yeah. Carla, did you want to add anything to Steve's comments? Happy to.
Look, I think it's appropriate, Steve's answer. I support that. I think we have a Know Your Weather, Know Your Risk campaign. So our responsibility is to, provide public education at that broader risk awareness, and potentially around, we could maybe message a little bit about the potential of heavy rainfall, but primary responsibility, I agree with Steve, sits with state and local government for that, and will be most effective at that level, realistically.
Yeah. I've got a question for you. It's just come up just now. Ray Wu has thanking you all for the information. He noticed that while flash floods are frequent, there seems to be a lack of documented case studies and analysis. Do you have any recommendations on effective methods to collect this data?
Oh, well, we just use this wonderful method.
Case studies approach would be a great approach.
And I think what's nice about that method is it really does try and bring all the actors together. So from the end-to-end warning value chain, and I think the thing that we would think about is there's lots of potential places to provide to make improvements, and what that sort of value chain approach encourages is to look at all those potential opportunities to improve. And we talked about a technical solution that Paul Fox-Hughes is talking about. Steve's emphasised the importance of improved communication. In the behind, we saw some administrative changes that have meant things have done a bit differently. So I think as a method and as an approach, it's really the context of that was it can be quite a low cost of method because it uses secondary sources, and it's not trying to do like a coronial inquiry type investigation. It's really trying to look at the whole story and in a collaborative way, certainly the way we approached it. And so in that sense, it can allow for a good conversation without fear of fault, really. Yeah.
I imagine everybody that participates actually learns quite a lot from others in the process. Yeah.
I think I can say I learned a lot, Nicola. So it's a wonderful experience.
It's a good shared learning opportunity.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Carla, and thank you to all of our panelists and everyone who joined us online today. Links to the webinar recording, the presentation material, and upcoming hazardous webinars will be sent out in the next week or two. NHRA's got plenty of online events coming up, including 2 hazardous webinars. Next up on the 27th of February is Lessons from the LA Fires and Implications for Australia. And the March hazardous webinar on the 18th of March is Resilient Housing Policies, a framework for evaluation. For updates for everything Natural Hazards Research Australia, please sign up to our newsletter and follow us on social media. And thank you everyone for your time today. A really good webinar. Congratulations. Thank you.